wind 050 at 8, runway 33, clear to land.
Clear land 33. We're good, weather update.
Affirmative, new information that I had just put out about 9 minutes ago. Visibility is 3/4, light snow, indefinite ceiling 1,200, and
4 minutes. That's how much time separated a warning that could have saved 6 lives. And the moment a Bombardier Challenger 650 flipped upside down on a runway in Bangor, Maine. 4 minutes during which 6 people sat in that business jet, unaware that another crew had just discovered something deadly about the weather conditions they were about to fly into. 4 minutes during which a conversation took place on a frequency they weren't monitoring. A conversation where one pilot told another that whatever was falling from the sky wasn't just snow, that it was clinging to aircraft wings like the de-icing fluid wasn't even there. 4 minutes that separated a warning from a tragedy. Today, we need to talk about what happened in Bangor on January 25th, 2026, because this isn't just another aircraft accident. This is a story about how information that could have prevented 6 deaths existed, was communicated between pilots, but never reached the crew that needed to hear it most. Let's start at the beginning. Bangor International Airport is located in northern Maine, about 2 hours north of Portland. It has one of the longest runways in the northeastern United States, nearly 12,000 feet long and 300 feet wide. That unusual width exists because Bangor is a joint-use airport serving both commercial traffic and the Maine Air National Guard. On January 25th, a major winter storm was moving through the northeastern United States. Over 6,000 flights had been canceled that weekend. The storm was bringing heavy snow, freezing fog, and something far more dangerous, ice pellets, not sleet, not freezing rain. Ice pellets, small frozen precipitation that clings to metal surfaces instantly. They don't melt, they don't blow off, they stick. And when they stick to an aircraft wing, they create a contamination problem that can be catastrophic. At approximately 6:09 p.m., a Bombardier Challenger 650 business jet touched down at Bangor. The aircraft registration was November 10 Kilo Juliet, registered to an LLC in Houston connected to Arnold and Itkin, a prominent law firm. On board were 6 people. The pilot was Jacob Hosmer, 47 years old. In the cabin were Tara Arnold, 46, an attorney and wife of the firm's co-founder. Also on board were Shauna Collins, an event planner, Nick Mastroscusa, a hospitality executive, and 2 other individuals, including a co-pilot. This was supposed to be a trip to Paris. The group had departed Houston earlier that day and stopped in Bangor to refuel and de-ice before crossing the Atlantic. The Challenger sat on the ground for over an hour and a half. During that time, the temperature was below 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow was falling. And critically, those ice pellets were beginning to mix in with the snow. When you're sitting on the ground in those temperatures, your aircraft becomes essentially a giant freezer. Any precipitation that touches those surfaces is going to freeze on contact. At some point during that time on the ground, the pilot taxied to the de-icing pad. The aircraft received a de-icing treatment using 2 types of fluid. Type 1 fluid removes existing contamination. Type 4 is a gel-like substance that prevents new contamination from adhering. It's a brilliant system, but it has limitations. Type 4 fluid has what's called a holdover time. In heavy snow, that might be 20 minutes. In ice pellets, significantly less. The Challenger remained at the de-icing pad for approximately 20 minutes. That's right at the edge of the holdover time for Type 4 fluid in heavy snow. But this wasn't just heavy snow. After 20 minutes, the Challenger taxied toward runway 33 for departure. The weather, while not great, was within operational limits. Visibility was 3/4 of a mile. Temperature was brutally cold. But planes were still operating. The airport was open. From the pilot's perspective, this was challenging, but not impossible. Here's where the story takes a turn that's going to make your heart sink. While the Challenger was being de-iced and preparing for departure, 2 other aircraft were ahead of them. One was an Allegiant Air commercial flight. The other was a Breeze Airways aircraft that uses the call sign Moxie. Both had also been de-iced and were preparing to depart. The Allegiant aircraft taxied to the runway, got into position, and then made a decision not to take off. They rejected before they even began the roll and returned to the ramp. That decision caught the attention of the Breeze crew. Why would a professional airline crew refuse to take off after going through the entire de-icing process? The Breeze crew wanted to know. So they did something that happens all the time in aviation. They asked to switch to a different frequency to talk to Allegiant directly. Air traffic control frequencies are public, but pilots can switch to other frequencies for coordination between aircraft. These are called air-to-air frequencies. They're perfectly legal and used all the time. The Breeze crew asked the tower if they could switch frequencies to talk to Allegiant. The tower approved. Both aircraft switched to a different frequency, and then a conversation took place that should have saved 6 lives but didn't. The Breeze crew asked Allegiant a direct question. Did you fail your pre-contamination checks? A pre-contamination check is a critical step in the de-icing process. After you've been de-iced, before you take the runway, you conduct a final check to verify that nothing has accumulated on the wings since you were treated. If you fail that check, if there's contamination on the wings, you do not take off, you return to the de-icing pad is non-negotiable. Allegiant's response was chilling, yeah. So I don't know what blew over at the end of the runway, but the visibility drops and it stuck to us like there was nothing there. It stuck to us like there was nothing there. That means the contamination adhered to their wings as if they had no de-icing fluid at all, as if the Type 4 fluid was completely ineffective against whatever was falling. Allegiant was describing a situation where their de-icing protection had been completely overwhelmed. They had failed their contamination check despite being freshly de-iced, and they were refusing to take off because attempting a takeoff with contaminated wings could be fatal. This conversation took place on a frequency that the Challenger crew was not monitoring. They had no idea this conversation had happened. They had no idea that a professional airline crew had just refused to take off because of severe contamination issues. They were monitoring the tower frequency, and on the tower frequency, everything seemed fine. The tower was giving weather updates, light snow, visibility 3/4 of a mile. All of that information suggests challenging but manageable conditions. Nothing screams do not take off. But the reality on the ground was very different from what the official weather report indicated, and the only people who knew that reality were the Allegiant crew and the Breeze crew, and they were talking on a frequency the Challenger wasn't monitoring. 4 minutes, that's how much time passed between the Allegiant warning to Breeze and the moment the Challenger was cleared for takeoff. 4 minutes during which the Challenger crew completed their taxi, ran their checks, and positioned themselves on runway 33. 4 minutes during which they had no idea that the conditions were far more dangerous than the weather report indicated. 4 minutes during which they could have asked questions, delayed, returned to the de-icing pad. But they didn't know. The information existed, but it never reached them. At approximately 7:45 p.m., the Challenger received their takeoff clearance. November 10 Kilo Juliet, Bangor Tower, runway 33 cleared for takeoff. The pilot acknowledged. The aircraft began its takeoff roll. The engines spooled up. According to ADS-B data, the aircraft reached approximately 175 knots. That's well above rotation speed. The pilot would have been pulling back on the yoke, raising the nose, and then something went catastrophically wrong. 45 seconds after being cleared for takeoff, a transmission came over the tower frequency. Aircraft upside down. We have a passenger aircraft upside down. The tower controller responded immediately. All traffic is stopped on the field. Crash trucks reached the scene in less than 1 minute. What they found was a Bombardier Challenger 650 flipped completely upside down on the runway, engulfed in flames. All 6 people on board were dead. The aircraft had rotated for takeoff with contaminated wings. One wing had stalled due to asymmetric lift, and the aircraft had rolled inverted and crashed back onto the runway. 6 people who had been alive and preparing for a trip to Paris were now dead. Hiduit, and the information that might have prevented their deaths had existed just 4 minutes earlier on a frequency they weren't monitoring. Let's talk about what ice pellets do to an aircraft wing. An aircraft wing generates lift through air flowing over the top and bottom. The shape creates lower pressure on top and higher pressure on the bottom. That pressure difference creates lift. But that process is incredibly sensitive to surface condition. Even a small amount of contamination can disrupt the airflow. The lift is reduced. And if the contamination is asymmetric, if one wing has more ice than the other, the aircraft will have uneven lift. When you're pulling back on the yoke at rotation speed, that asymmetry will cause the aircraft to roll. One wing drops, the other rises, and if you're already near the stall, that roll can become uncontrollable in a fraction of a second. The Bombardier Challenger 600 series has a documented history with this exact failure mode. In January 2002, a Challenger crashed in Birmingham, England. during takeoff in winter weather. British investigators determined that wing contamination, possibly too small for pilots to see, had caused the accident. In November 2004, another Challenger crashed in Montrose, Colorado, during takeoff in light snow. 3 people were killed. The NTSB determined there was trace icing on the wings, imperceptible to the naked eye. When it rotated for takeoff, one wing stalled, the aircraft rolled, and it crashed. But the NTSB determined that Bombardier had not adequately disclosed that the Challenger's airfoil was extremely sensitive to even trace amounts of ice contamination. After that Montrose crash, the FAA took action. They published new rules clarifying that even a small amount of frost on wings could cause a catastrophic problem. In 2008, the FAA issued a directive requiring a specific warning in the Challenger 600 flight manual stating that ice, frost, or slush on wings could cause loss of control during takeoff. All of those regulatory changes happened. All of those warnings were added. And yet, 22 years after the Birmingham crash, another Challenger crashed in almost identical circumstances, takeoff in winter weather, contaminated wings, aircraft rolled, inverted, all occupants killed. Here's what makes this accident so particularly tragic. The Allegiant crew knew they had experienced the conditions, they described it perfectly. Something blew over us. It stuck to us like there was nothing there. That's not continuous light snow. That's a burst of ice pellets or concentrated severe icing that the weather report didn't capture. The Allegiant crew, professional pilots with experience in winter operations, made exactly the right decision. They refused to take off. That decision probably saved over 100 lives. The Breeze crew heard that warning and could factor it into their decision. But the Challenger crew had none of that information. They were monitoring the tower frequency where everything sounded routine. They had been de-iced. They had no reason to believe conditions were worse than reported. So they accepted their takeoff clearance and attempted to depart. And the same severe icing that happened to Allegiant happened to them. But unlike Allegiant, they were already committed to the takeoff. They were at high speed. They had rotated. And when that contamination hit their wings, the aircraft rolled and crashed. Here's the question that's going to haunt this investigation. Should the Allegiant crew have communicated their experience to air traffic control? Should they have said on the tower frequency where everyone could hear that they had encountered severe icing conditions? There's no regulation that requires them to do that. When a crew rejects a takeoff, they're not obligated to explain why over the radio. And in the moment, they may not have realized how significant their experience was. But in aviation, we have a culture of sharing safety information. When you experience something unusual, something hazardous, something that could affect other aircraft, you're supposed to share that information, not because it's legally required, but because it's the right thing to do. And in this case, that information was shared, but only between 2 crews on a private frequency. It never made it to the tower. It never made it to other aircraft waiting to depart. And 4 minutes later, 6 people were dead. Let's talk about what was actually falling from the sky that night. There's audio from a Ring doorbell camera near the airport that captured the moment of the crash. You hear a bang in the distance when the aircraft impacts. You hear a dog barking. But if you keep listening, you hear something else, a crackling sound. Not rain. Not the soft sound of snow. A hard, crackling, pelting sound. That's ice pellets hitting the microphone. That's ice pellets hitting windows and roofs and every surface. If you've ever experienced ice pellets, you know that sound. It's distinctive, it's sharp, and it means frozen precipitation is falling hard enough to make noise on impact. Pilots who have flown extensively in northern climates recognize that sound instantly. It's the sound of danger, because ice pellets don't blow off surfaces, they accumulate. And when they hit a cold metal wing, they stick immediately. De-icing fluid can't keep up with ice pellets. They penetrate it, they stick to the wing surface underneath it. And once they're there, you have a contaminated wing. And a contaminated wing on a Challenger at rotation speed means you're going to crash. Here's the broader systemic issue that this accident exposes. Aviation safety depends on the flow of information. We have elaborate systems for disseminating weather information. But those systems have gaps. They don't always capture localized conditions. and they don't capture the experiential knowledge that pilots gain by actually operating in the conditions. When a pilot encounters hazardous conditions, the best source of information for the next pilot is often the first pilot. That's why we have pilot reports. But that system only works if pilots actually make those reports. And it only works if the reports are on frequencies that other aircraft are monitoring. In this case, critical information existed. It was communicated, but it was communicated peer-to-peer on a frequency that wasn't monitored by the aircraft that needed to hear it. That's a failure mode that the aviation system hasn't fully addressed. We rely on informal crew-to-crew communication for safety information, but that informal communication happens outside the official system. And when it stays outside the system, it doesn't reach everyone who needs it. The NTSB is going to look very carefully at this aspect. They're going to ask whether there should be requirements for crews to report hazardous conditions to ATC rather than just to each other. They're going to ask whether controllers should be more proactive in asking crews why they're rejecting takeoffs. They're going to ask whether there's a way to capture and disseminate peer-to-peer safety information more effectively. Yeah, what we know right now is that 6 people are dead. Tara Arnold, a 46-year-old attorney and mother of 2. Jacob Hosmer, a 47-year-old pilot. Shauna Collins, an event planner. Nick Mastroscusa, a hospitality executive and father of 3. 2 other people whose names we don't yet know officially. They died because they didn't have information that existed 4 minutes before they attempted to take off. They died because a conversation happened on a frequency they weren't monitoring. They died because the informal system of peer-to-peer safety communication worked exactly as it always has, but that system has a fatal flaw. The information doesn't always reach everyone who needs it. This is one of the most frustrating types of accidents to analyze because it feels so preventable. If the Allegiant crew had made their report on the tower frequency, the Challenger crew would have heard it. If the Challenger crew had delayed 5 more minutes, they might have heard another indication that conditions were worse than expected. If the weather observation had captured the ice pellets instead of reporting light snow, the crew might have made a different decision. Any one of those factors could have broken the chain. But none of them did, and 6 people died. For pilots, this accident is a stark reminder. Winter operations are unforgiving. If you're operating in conditions where ice can form, you need to be meticulous about de-icing, holdover times, and contamination checks. Official weather reports don't always capture reality. If you see other aircraft refusing to depart, that's a huge red flag. Ask questions. Find out why. The Challenger 600 series has a documented vulnerability to wing contamination. If you're flying one, be especially cautious in winter weather. Even trace amounts of ice can be catastrophic. And most importantly, information is safety. If you experience hazardous conditions, report them. Don't just tell your buddy on another frequency. Tell ATC. Get it into the system. Make sure every aircraft that's going to follow you knows what you encountered. Your experience could save lives. The preliminary report from the NTSB will be available within 30 days. That report will lay out the facts, but it won't answer the big questions. It won't tell us whether hearing the Allegiant warning would have changed the crew's decision. All of that comes later in the final report. But when that final report does come out, it's going to describe in detail how 6 people died for lack of information that existed, that was communicated, but that never reached them. How 4 minutes separated a warning from a crash. How a conversation on a different frequency could have saved 6 lives. If you take away one thing from this video, let it be this. In aviation, information is not just data, it's life. When you encounter something hazardous, something unusual, something that could affect other aircraft, get that information into the system, make the radio call, file the pilot report, tell the controller. Don't assume someone else will do it. Don't assume it's not important enough because somewhere, maybe 4 minutes behind you, there's another aircraft whose crew is making decisions based on the information they have. And if they don't have the information you have, they might make a decision that kills them. That's the lesson of Bangor. 6 people died because information didn't flow. 6 people died because a critical safety message happened on the wrong frequency. 6 people died in the gap between what was known and what was communicated. We can't bring them back. But we can learn from their deaths. We can close that gap. We can make sure that the next crew has the information they need, because in aviation, that's how we honor the dead. We learn, we improve, and we make damn sure it doesn't happen again.